He described himself as a fat, ugly, balding, homosexual Jew. But for more than 3 decades, Neil Rogers ruled the airwaves in South Florida with conversations like this one.
Sounds like some kind of Neanderthal fascist commie pinko conspiracy to me.
Automobiles to one boat.
Right, exactly.
Now the boat is going to stop for 5,000 cars? Is that it?
No, I think that 50,000 cars ought to stop for one jackass in his boat. I think that's what they ought to do.
You see, Neil could get away with saying anything about anybody, and no one was immune from his vitriol, whether you were the bridge tender, his boss, or yours truly. Last week's memorial service was a tribute to the sharp-tongued, quick-as-a-whip host who both entertained and enraged. His longtime producer, George Rodriguez, spoke at the service, which attracted about 300 friends and fans.
People from out of town who just don't understand. They say, oh, Howard, oh, we got somebody like that. No, you didn't. No, you never had anybody like Neil in your town.
Rodriguez says while comparisons to the likes of Howard Stern are inevitable, Neil Rogers was unique and uniquely South Florida.
People from this area could go to other markets and not hear anything like Neil and come back and know that he was a one-of-a-kind and he was all ours and belonged just to us.
Among his most ardent listeners was Mike Lance of Miami Beach, known better by Neil's nickname for him, Blind Mike.
Even though he made fun of people and made fun of me and apologized about my guide dog, he was different. He was unique. He made people think.
In fact, if you hadn't been ripped by Neil on the ear, you hadn't really arrived in South Florida. Legendary local disc jockey Rick Shaw, or Ricky Ticky as he was known, says he was kind of jealous of what his colleague could get away with on the radio.
Well, Neil was one of a kind. He was the talk guy that everybody looked up to. He raised the bar several notches. He said the things that all of us thought but wouldn't say out loud, and he said them on the radio.
But Uncle Neil was also known for a serious side. In the 1970s, at the height of former beauty queen Anita Bryant's campaign to repeal a Dade County ordinance prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, Neil did something that could have ruined his career.
He was among the very first public figures, certainly in South Florida, to come out on the air live.
That's Steve Rothaus, who writes about the gay and lesbian community now for the Miami Herald, and once worked with Neil at the old WKAT.
Neil had been at WKAT for probably a year or so, and he was so angry, he was so upset with what was happening, that it just came out.
Rogers, though, was far from an advocate for the gay community. Instead, he chose to make fun of them in a self-deprecating manner. Neil was a mostly local phenomenon. Attempts to syndicate his program, won by Howard Stern himself, failed over the years, as did attempts to lure him to larger markets. His longtime attorney, Norm Kent, says more exposure simply was not important to Neil.
Even though we had national gigs and offers, he would rather go home and watch a hockey game than drive to 135th and Biscayne and do a CNN gig. He would rather take the contract he had, where he had 13 weeks and the summers off and a studio in Toronto, than take a gig on a national syndication where he'd have to work 48 weeks a year.
The most ironic part of the day to remember Neil Rogers is that Neil himself would never have come to an event like this. But it did serve as closure for Neilies, like me, everywhere. We'll miss you, Uncle Neil.
Phil Latzman.
WLRN, Miami Herald News.